The audio hobby can be kind of in its own world at times. I would imagine if a regular person were to stumble upon a forum thread and see a sentence like, "The ear gain on this IEM doesn't quite match up to my HRTF," I think they would have an aneurysm. And here's where I realized that there's actually not a lot of guides out there that are specifically catered to people that know absolutely nothing about audio. Yes, there are guides that try to define how we describe sound, for example, from Mark Ryan on Super Reviews or even from Timmy on Hangout.audio. But again, that's just all specifically sound terms, how you describe the things that you're hearing, but not necessarily things like the equipment, the gear, terminations, etc. So today I would like to talk about all of the terms that I think that you, dear viewer, should know when diving headfirst into the audio hobby. For those of you who think yourselves as veterans in the audio hobby, I still think that this video would be important in some way. Just because you might be involved in, let's say, the IEM scene doesn't necessarily mean you would also be familiar with speaker terminology or even source terminology. So without further ado, let's get into our crash course of the audio hobby. Now, this guide will be split into different sections, so for those of you who get a little bit overwhelmed, timestamps are all in the description below. First, let's talk about the terms that describe the equipment that we would be using. First of all, would be, of course, earphones. Simply put, earphones are the devices that go into your ears in some way. And one subset of earphones would be TWS or True Wireless Stereo, though most people call them True Wireless Buds. They're the ones with the case and the two separate buds that you put into your ears. Very common. AirPods, for example, would be a TWS. Then, of course, we have headphones. Headphones are the devices that go over the ear in some way and typically come with a headband that sits on top of your head. Then we have speakers, sometimes called loudspeakers or even monitors. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. It's a device that makes sound and throws it at your face. Now we go into a category called sources. There's 4 different types of products that usually can be called as source gear. First of all would be the DAP, otherwise known as the digital audio player. Back in the day, we would call these MP3 players, iPods. Nowadays, it's just simply a music player. Then we have something called the DAC, otherwise called a DAC. It is abbreviated from the word digital to analog converter. This is a chip or an entire product that takes your digital files and converts them into analog signals that we can hear. Next, we have the amplifier. This would be a chip or even an entire product whose sole purpose is to take the signal that has been converted from the DAC and then amplify it to a level that we can listen to. Next would be the subset of the amplifier, the power amplifier. Power amplifiers are used to refer to amplifiers that are specifically for powering speakers. That is a very basic overview of the products and equipment that we'll be using in the audio hobby. Next, we will be talking about the different form factors of these products. So within earphones, we talk about 2 different wearing styles, the earbuds as well as the in-ears. Earbuds are the type of devices that sit on top of your ears. They don't really seal around, so you can hear a lot of the outside environment coming in. Something like the earpods, for example, would be classified as an earbud. In-ears, on the other hand, are devices that go into your ear canal and seal around it, so it blocks out a lot of environmental noise. Sometimes in-ears are also referred to as IEMs, which stand for in-ear monitors. It's used interchangeably quite a lot in the hobby. When someone refers to an IEM, they usually just mean an in-ear earphone. So no need to get confused, IEMs just mean the same thing. Next, I'll be talking about the shell shape of earphones. First, we'll be talking about custom versus universal. Custom IEMs usually refer to the IEMs that are specifically molded to each individual ear. When someone orders a custom IEM, what they usually do first is to make an ear impression, that is to say putting putty into the entire ear and then taking out the hardened mold thereafter. An IEM would then be made using the shape of that mold as a reference point. So custom IEMs result in a perfect fit, assuming that nothing else goes wrong, which is in stark contrast to something called a universal IEM. Universal IEMs, as the name implies, just means that you put on an ear tip and then it fits on anyone's ears. kind of. Within the universal IEMs, there's also two different shell types that I would like to talk about. First of all would be pseudo-custom, as well as negative profile. Pseudo-custom, as the name implies, looks kind of like a custom IEM, but is done in a way that tries to still be universal for many people. A good pseudo-custom universal IEM would be very comfortable, contouring to all the various recesses inside our ear shape. Then we have a different kind of shell shape called the negative profile fit. Usually you would see IEMs from, let's say, Westone, some Shure, even Sennheiser does them nowadays. It is a very small compact shell that terminates out into kind of a 45-degree angle, and is said to be one of the more comfortable shell types because it's so small and can be worn by people even with smaller ears. Anything outside of that, I would regard them as non-conventional, which is kind of a big blanket statement to say that they don't fit into either pseudo-custom nor negative profile. In terms of headphones, we have the open back as well as the closed back design. Open back just means that the back of the cup is fully vented and open to the outside environment. This means that outside noise would leak in, and for people who listen at very loud volumes, their own music would also leak out. Closed back, on the other hand, means that the entire cup is completely sealed off from the outside world. This means that compared to an open back, it blocks outside noise better. It also doesn't allow your own music to leak out as much. But there also could be some cons, like your ears warming up a bit too much, for example. Still on headphones, now we talk about the on-ear design versus the over-ear design. Over-ear, as the name implies, means that the entire cup surrounds your ear. On-ear, as the name implies again, means that the pads on the headphones are pressing up against the flange of your ears. Now let's talk about speakers, and in this case I can really only think of three. First of all would be the computer/desktop speaker, the bookshelf speaker, as well as the floor standing speaker. Desktop speakers, or more accurately computer speakers, tend to be much more compact, tiny, so that they can fit on any kind of desk, usually with a monitor right in the middle. Bookshelf speakers, on the other hand, tend to be larger than the average computer speaker. They typically start at 5-inch woofers and above. And then we have floor standing speakers, which again, as the name implies, means that the speakers are built to stand on the floor. Now let's talk about sources, which also come in three different flavors. First would be the desktop form factor, followed by the portable form factor, and finally the dongle. Desktop sources, for example, desktop amps, desktop decks, as the name implies, means that they are meant to sit on a desk, which also means that they usually are wall powered. So they typically are larger than usual, clearly not portable, which does bring me to my next point, which would be portable sources. A lot of portable sources tend to be battery powered, which means that yes, while they are portable, they tend to also be fairly large. And finally, we have the dongle form factor, which is powered purely from USB. They don't need to use any batteries, which means that they can be made very small and very compact, hence the name, the dongle. It dangles out. Moving on to our next section, now we'll be talking about the drivers. And of course, the first word that we have to define would be the word itself, driver. Drivers are the thing inside your device that actually move to make the sound. Kind of as simple as that. Now within the audio hobby, now we have to talk about the different types of drivers, because you know that we are just obsessed with that. The most common driver type you would see would be the dynamic driver, sometimes abbreviated as DD. This is used very commonly in headphones as well as IEMs, typically as a single driver solution. They're cheap, they're robust, and if you tune them well, they can sound really, really good. Next, we have something called the planar, sometimes referred to as planar magnetic or even orthodynamic. The planar driver uses similar mechanics compared to the DD, but done differently enough where they become their own driver type. But again, this is a crash course. As much as I would like to get into the weeds of all of this, we have no time. Moving on. Next, we have the balanced amateur driver, sometimes abbreviated as BA. This is a driver that is commonly used in hearing aids, but now is also used in IEMs, typically in a multi-driver setup. Next, we have a driver called the electrostatic driver, which is completely different from all the rest that I've talked about. Electrostatic drivers are so different that they require something called an energizer, which is also different from an amplifier. Most people would know electrostatic headphones because of a Japanese brand called Stax. And in the IEM world, a lot of brands prefer to use something called the EST, or electrostatic tweeter, which is made by Sony. Now it comes to a point where, of course, I know that there are so many other driver types out there, but again, this is a crash course. I would just be skipping all of them. Now let's talk about how these drivers are divided. First of all will be what I've actually mentioned before, and that is the tweeter. Tweeters are the ones that play the high frequencies. If you look at a conventional speaker, for example, the tweeter is usually the smaller one. Next, we have the woofer. The woofer driver typically plays the low and the mid-range frequencies. As I mentioned, in a typical two-way speaker setup, you have the tweeter, the smaller one, as well as the woofer, which is usually the bigger one. And of course, if there's a tweeter and a woofer, that means that there would be a mid-range driver as well. The mid-range driver is a bit more rare in the speaker world, though obviously they still do exist. It is more relevant in the context of IEM designs, where you have drivers that play exclusively in the mid frequencies and then probably one extra on both ends to play the bass and the treble. And of course, we have everyone's favorite driver, the subwoofer. In the context of speakers, the subwoofer is sometimes an entirely separate unit of its own. So you have two speakers pointing towards you, and then you have a subwoofer that can be placed almost anywhere else inside the room to give you that low end thump. And in the context of IEM design, it usually refers to a driver that does 100 Hz and below. I realize that you probably don't know what a hertz is, so it just means really low sounds. And our final term for this section would be the term hybrid. Hybrid means that different types of drivers are being used in that one device. It is usually very common in the context of IEMs, where you would have a DD and a BA being used inside it. And in the context of speakers, you'll probably more commonly see it in an AMT DD hybrid design. Next, let's talk about the terms that describe the technology within the audio space. First, let's talk about the terms passive and active. Passive means that it doesn't need any additional electronics to work, whereas active means that it requires the additional electronics to work. For example, those of you who use wireless products would probably be familiar with this abbreviation ANC, which stands for active noise cancellation. The word active means that they're using separate electronics to power this noise cancelling system. ANC is typically great for low frequency noise like the rumble of airplanes, for example. But for the higher frequency sound, what we would typically rely on would be passive noise isolation. Again, the word passive means that no electronics are required for this to work. It's kind of like earmuffs, for example. You put on a pair of closed back headphones or even IEMs, and there you have it. Passive noise isolation. That's where you hear the world as kind of a little bit muffled and a bit softer in general. That's isolation. Next, within the wireless audio space, you probably have come across this term, ambient mode, otherwise known as transparency mode. So because the wireless device that you're using would usually be a closed back headphone or an in-ear, that means that it already has quite a bit of isolation going on. So in order for you to hear your environment again, what the device has to do is use their microphones to pipe in the outside noise and kind of replay it back into your head. So what this mode is trying to do is basically to remove the isolation that is already kind of built into your audio device. Next, let's talk about Bluetooth and, well, the codecs that are usually used in them. The ones that you typically see would be SBC and ANC. Almost every wireless Bluetooth device I know has at least these two. AAC works on basically every device by virtue of the fact that Apple only uses AAC. SBC can be used on Windows, on Android, and basically virtually anything that is not Apple. Then we have aptX, which is technically a high quality version of the SBC and AAC codecs. Then we have LDAC, which is arguably the highest quality codec, though it is proprietary to Sony, and then they license it out to other brands. Now, occasionally you'll probably see devices with this, a 2.4 gigahertz dongle. Now, while Bluetooth also uses 2.4-ish gigahertz, what this means is that the brand is probably using their own proprietary 2.4 gigahertz band, and this results in usually better stability, better signals, but at the cost of having to use a separate dongle. Now let's talk about this weird little word, DSP, which stands for Digital Signal processing. It sounds weird, it sounds complicated, but actually this is the umbrella term to describe stuff like Apple Spatial Audio or even Dolby Atmos. What this means is there's a software or algorithm somewhere that is processing the audio signal before it gets fed back into your ears. And finally, we have equalization, otherwise abbreviated as EQ. EQ is also a form of DSP and is the simplest way to change the sound of your audio device right off the bat. You'll find that some music player applications would have EQ settings that kind of look like sliders that you can play up and you can hear the differences as well. All of that is equalization, and there is software that can allow you to do a lot more with higher customization, which I won't get into right now. Now we get into the section where we talk about audio terminations, because the industry cannot be consistent. First, the word single-ended. Now, there's a very nerdy way for me to explain this specifically, but I'm just gonna give the most surface level explanation, and that is, this is the basic way to connect your audio device. How do you connect a single-ended, you may ask? Well, with the typical headphone jack, otherwise known as a 3.5mm jack, sometimes referred to as an 1/8 inch jack. Now, when you hold up a headphone jack, you would see rings on the jack itself. Well, to explain, this is called TRS or TRRS. Now, why am I explaining this in a crash course video? Well, to put it simply, if you want to use something like, let's say, a microphone, you need a TRRS jack. That means that you have an additional layer for your microphone signal to go into your audio device, and a TRS jack would not have that. Now, when you're playing around specifically with sources and speakers, sometimes you might come across this. This is called an RCA jack. It comes in two parts, left and right, and allows you to connect maybe your DAC or even your amp into your speakers, or even your DAC into your amplifier. Next, let's talk about the term balanced, because this is probably something you'll hear quite often within the source space. Balanced is a more complicated version of single-ended, and what it does is that it allows for noise rejection within the wire itself. The unfortunate truth is that when you have a very, very long wire, it kind of acts as an antenna of sorts. So the longer your wire, the more noise it can pick up, and in some very bad cases, you can absolutely hear it. Going balanced allows for the signal to be rejected and lets you, the user, use longer cables without having to worry about noise. Now, within the balance specification, you have a few terminations. First of all, would be very popular within the IM space, and that is the 4.4mm termination. Yes, this jack is bigger than your typical headphone jack and runs a balanced signal. You also have XLR, which comes with 3 pins, and more common with headphones, speakers, as well as source gear. Occasionally, you might find the 2.5mm balanced jack. As the name implies, it is smaller than your typical headphone jack, but also runs everything in balance. Now, sometimes you might stumble upon this jack, the 1/4 inch jack. It is bigger than 3.5 and is typically used in the pro audio industry. It can run single-ended and balanced depending on the source gear. Within the speaker market, if you're running passive speakers, which, reminder, means that there's no additional electronics that's powering the speaker, the terminations that you usually find to power your speakers would be banana plugs or spade plugs. Banana plugs are plugs that are typically spring-loaded, which means that you just slide them into their respective holes and it usually just clicks in. Spade plugs, on the other hand, are plugs that you would slide underneath and kind of screw them in. Not as common nowadays, but common enough that I think warrants a mention even in a crash course video. If you're someone looking to plug your device into a DAC, sometimes you would see this, an optical termination, sometimes known as Toslink. As the name implies, it means that it uses light to send on the digital signals into the device of choice. Within the IM space, because there is such an emphasis on detachable cables, there's also quite a few terminations that you would have to take note of. First, the most common connection would be the 2-pin connection, which is sometimes known as the 0.78mm pin connection. Next, we have something called the QDC or UE extruded connectors, which first of all, clearly uses an extruded connection, and second of all, actually uses a different size of pins, 0.75mm to be exact. And finally, we have MMCX. This is a small connector that clicks into place and thereafter allows for an entire 360-degree swivel on the cable. Now, let's talk about specifications, the things that you would see at the back of your packaging material. First, let's talk about volume, decibels, otherwise known as dB. This is a measure of how loud something is, or more specifically, how loud something can go. Next, we have power, which is rated in watts, though more accurately, it is measured in milliwatts in the context of portable audio. Now we have impedance measured in ohms. A simple explanation would be how hard is it to power your device. Next, we have sensitivity, which as you can see is measured in decibels per milliwatt. As the units imply, it means how loud your device can go given a single milliwatt of power. Next, we have output impedance, which is also measured in ohms, but this metric is specifically only for amplifiers. Sometimes this is called Z-out. Usually you would like to have a very low value, as low as under 1. And the reason for this is that some IEMs actually change their sound depending on the output impedance. So within the audio hobby, rule of thumb is as low as you can go as possible. Again, the goal is usually under 1. Now there is a specification called frequency range, which is marked as certain hertz all the way up to certain hertz. This specification is really the most relevant in speakers, because in speakers you do have limited bandwidth. Some speakers can only go as low as a certain bass amount and only as high as a certain treble amount. The ones that know their stuff would add in an extra thing, for example, -3 decibels. What this means is that how much the speaker would roll off, which would then be marked in their frequency range. So the bass rolls off -3 decibels at 40 hertz, then that's where they start their mark. And if the bass rolls off after, let's say, 15,000 hertz, that's where they also start their mark. And finally, we have THD. Total harmonic distortion. Usually this is a measure of how loud a speaker can go before it starts, well, not performing very well. In most cases, THD is not relevant in the spec sheet. A lot of devices can reach a low enough THD, and they only really get problematic as you push more power into them. Now let's talk about the music files, because yes, we are in audio. The music files can be separated into two different categories. One would be lossy and the other one would be lossless. Lossy would be stuff like MP3s, AACs, or even OGGs. Lossy means that the file is cutting off certain parts of the data in order to make the file size smaller. Thereafter, you can then select how much you want to further compress the files. For example, when it comes to MP3s, you have 128 kilobytes per second, 192, 256, or the maximum, which would be 320. And for reference, the OGG format is being used by music streaming platforms such as Spotify. Now let's talk about lossless formats, and really nowadays there's only two: FLAC and ALAC. FLAC, which stands for Free Lossless Audio Codec, is the most universal one and is usually the ones that people refer to when they talk about their lossless files. ALAC means Apple Lossless Audio Codec, and as the name implies, it means that it's exclusively used by Apple. Now the last kind of music file would be the completely uncompressed version, which is, well, the WAV file. Lossless files are still compressed in some way, kind of like a zip file if you will, but when it gets uncompressed, there is no data loss whatsoever, hence the name lossless. Uncompressed file formats, again like WAV, means that there is no compression going on whatsoever, which means that these files are extremely large. Now, how would you quantify the performance of all of these music files? Well, first of all, we will talk about bit rate, then we talk about sampling rate, and finally, bit depth. So bit rate, as the name implies, is how many bits per second the music file is able to transmit. So as I've mentioned before, MP3 allows for a maximum of 320 kilobits per second of data. And if you use your typical 1644 lossless file, you usually get 1400 kilobits per second of data. Now, to describe lossless audio, you also need to talk about sampling rate as well as bit depth. Sampling rate is, at the very simplest explanation I can give, how many times the audio is sampled. So what this means usually is that with a higher sampling rate, you get more high frequency information. The typical sampling rate would be stuff like 44.1 kilohertz, 48, sometimes 96, 192. It can go as high as you want it to be, usually capping out at about 764, for example. Bit depth, on the other hand, determines how quiet the sound can get in that music file. The typical lossless bit depth, which is 16 bits or CD quality, is good enough for most people. The next step up would be 24 bits, which does give you more dynamic range. And then there's also 32, but I don't think a lot of recordings actually go that far. Now let's talk about PCM, or pulse code modulation. Basically, this is the typical way in which audio is processed. So why is this information in a crash course video? For the fact that there are two other ways in which audio is processed that you might just stumble upon. This is DSD, direct stream digital. And the reason why this is relevant is because to use DSD files, you need a DAC that is specifically supporting DSD. So sometimes when you buy a DAC and on the packaging it says DSD supported, you now know why. And finally, we have MQA, which is a topic that I would not like to touch, but I still have to mention. MQA is also its own file format. It's a different way to process audio, which means that to use MQA files, you need a DAC that supports MQA. Now let's talk about the terms that describe sound. And this is a section that is extremely subjective. Everyone have their own definitions, their own meanings, and it's for that reason that I'll only be selecting terms and words that kind of are in universal agreement. First, let's talk about this thing. This is called a frequency response graph, or just simply graph. This is a way that we can visualize the flavor of the audio device that we're listening to. I'm not going to talk about how to read it. There's plenty of guides out there, including my own, so go there instead. Next, let's talk about what divides up the sound, and that is the bass, the mids, and the treble. Bass is, well, to put it simply, it's the doof, the thump, the whatever you call that one. It is the low frequency hits, the one that kind of makes up the drums, the beat, the 808s, all that sorts of things. The mids are where the melody of the instruments lie. This is where you hear the most amount of information, if you will. In terms of frequency, it's also extremely subjective. Some would put mids at around 300 to about, let's say, 5 kilohertz, for example. I personally put mids around the 200 to about 4 to maybe 5,000 hertz region. And then we get into the treble region, which is where all of the brightness, the shimmeriness, the brilliance exists. This is where the hi-hats, the upper harmonics of all the instruments lie. Again, where treble begins would be a point of contention. Some would argue it only starts after 6 kilohertz. Some would say, oh, it starts already around 2 to 3,000 hertz. But in general, in terms of the vibes, yes, treble exists where, you know, bright, sparkliness, brilliance, all those kind of common descriptors. Next, let's talk about soundstage. And the simple explanation I can give, soundstage is the stage in which all the instruments are in. So for example, if you, let's say, have a 4-man band, you could put them in a studio, and that is where the soundstage is, kind of in a tiny room. Or you can put them in an orchestral stage, and where the sound can propagate all over this new imaginary hall, which is why a lot of times we describe soundstage in terms of size and width, sometimes even in depth as well. Now, very closely related to soundstage would be the word imaging, which is shortened from another word, stereo imaging. Imaging talks about the placements of all the instruments. So it could very well be that you are existing in a very wide soundstage, but your imaging could be incorrect or inaccurate. Or it could be that you are in a very tiny stage, but you still get pinpoint imaging where you can easily identify all the spatial cues where all the instruments are at. Imaging again talks about the placement of the instruments and the accuracy of said placements. But at the end of the day, whether the imaging is actually accurate is still a very much subjective thing all by itself. A lot of people can disagree on whether or not a headphone or an IEM is accurate in terms of all of these pinpoint spatial cues. All right, now let's talk about the different ways in which you could describe flavors of sound, and one of which would be V-shaped. The word V-shape is using flat as a reference. When you have a flat sound and you enhance the bass and the treble, what you get is a V. V-shaped sound signatures are typically characterized by a very energetic and punchy and lively sound by virtue of enhancing the beats as well as enhancing, well, hi-hats and all that. On the other hand, neutral and flat just simply means it's nothing really stands out. Everything exists on a flat plane. Flat is the most accurate in the context of speakers. When you measure speakers and they turn out flat, usually that means that it is flat. Neutral and flat, in my opinion, are describing kind of the same things. If something is neutral, by the objective definition of it, it means that nothing is recessed, emphasized, and everything just sounds like it's at the same volume. And if that is the definition of neutral, that means that flat would also mean neutral. Flat means that nothing's emphasized, nothing's recessed, everything existing again on the same plane. Now, occasionally when you trawl through all of the forums, you would see references to this name, Harman. So what is it? Harman is research on what the most amount of people prefer in the tuning of a headphone or earphone. So when something is said to be tuned to Harman, they do have a target curve and the headphone or earphone hits that target well enough. You might also see references to diffuse field, sometimes abbreviated as DF. This is neutral in the context of headphones as well as earphones. They are measured in a diffuse field environment, and thereafter, if something is tuned to that, it means that, well, theoretically, flat-ish. Next, let's talk about treble levels, which is typically described as bright or dark or anything in between. So brightness just means a lot of treble, darkness means a lack of treble, and, well, everything up and down there and other similar descriptors usually refer to the treble. For example, brilliance, sparkle, shadowy, anything related to light is somehow related to treble in some way. Next, we have the word warmth. And I think after a while, we have all agreed that warmth just means a general down-tilted presentation. What that means usually is that the bass is of a higher level than the mids, and the mids are of a higher level than the treble. So the sound is, well, not quite dark, but it does impart a feeling of fullness as well as more thicker sound in general. Sibilance is a term that is also often used to describe a shortfall in the treble. Sibilance usually refers to a boost in the consonant sounds like the tts and the ss. I can't remember all of the descriptors for them right now. But for an IEM headphone or speaker to be considered sibilant, it means that the moment these consonants are used, people just generally feel like it pierces them. There's a sharpness to it that they cannot endure. And finally, this word, which seems like it is pronounced timbre, but actually is pronounced timbre. Blame the French. Timbre is an all-encompassing word to generally describe how natural sounding something is. Usually it is paired with the word natural or unnatural. To have a natural timbre, it means that everything generally sounds correct. Whereas on the other hand, an unnatural timbre usually means that something somewhere went wrong and it just sounds not natural as a result. And there it is. That is the crash course. If you know all of these audiophile terminologies, you could survive a discussion with an audiophile. I'm not saying that you could have a proper conversation, a proper discussion. I would say that you could probably just hold your own. For everyone else, this is a starting point. If you want to know more, again, plenty of guides are out there on the internet today. But for now, all I do is to introduce you to the rabbit hole. And it's by your own accord on whether you want to jump right in. And now let me shout out my big money boys. Here are all of your names you have subscribed to the $20 tier on my Patreon. And for those of you who have subscribed to my $30 tier, allow me to speak out your beautiful names: Crinacle, Andrew, Seraphim, and Daryl. I thank you all. I will see you guys next week, and don't die. Fuck off.